Okay, picture the Bahamas. What comes to mind first? I bet it's, crystal clear water, maybe those white sand beaches, that whole island vibe.
It looks like paradise.
Exactly, like a postcard.
Yeah.
But if you look just beneath that surface, you find this history that's way more complex, um, even turbulent, and honestly pretty surprising.
Oh, absolutely. It's a real crossroads. You've got ancient migrations, you've got empires clashing, incredible human resilience, and just some really unique cultural stuff happening. It's not simple at all.
And well, that's why we're here,
Hmm.
right? You've given us this stack of sources, articles, research notes, and our job, our mission in this deep dive is basically to unpack all of that.
Yeah, pull out the really important bits, the unexpected connections, the context you need.
Exactly, to give you a shortcut, really, so you can feel genuinely clued in about this fascinating
We'll
place.
work through it together, point out what jumps out, and, help connect the dots. Ready to dive in?
I am. Let's unpack this stack. Where do we even start? Like way back,
Yeah.
before any Europeans, who was actually living there?
Right. Okay, so we need to go back over 1,000 years. The first people we know about are the Lucayans. They were part of the Taino group, speaking an Arawakan language.
Taino, okay.
And the research points to them coming from South America near the Orinoco River, probably migrating north around, say, 8,800 to 900.
Wow, the Orinoco. That's quite a trek across the water. How'd they manage that?
Well, they were really skilled mariners. They used these large dugout canoes to navigate the Caribbean, island hopping until they reached and settled the Bahamas.
So they weren't just like visiting, they built communities.
Oh, yeah, settled communities. They were horticulturalists, farmers, basically, growing corn, beans, manioc, sweet potatoes, also things like cotton, cashews, papayas.
Okay, so farming. But the islands are all about the sea, too, right?
Yeah, definitely. They were expert fishers. The sources mention things like woven conch nets, and their tools were mostly made from shells, though they did use some stone, kind of using what the environment offered.
Makes sense. Shells and stone.
Yeah.
What about their society? How was it structured?
Well, the material suggests it was matrilineal, in some ways tracing descent through the mother's line, but leadership seems to have been mostly male, often based around these ritual ball courts.
All courts. Interesting.
Yeah. And there's mention of a sort of dual gender structure, maybe different roles or identities. They also had these really distinct ways of like carving and marking shells. Some beautiful artistry there.
You can almost picture it. And a lot of this knowledge comes from archaeology finds, doesn't it?
Exactly. Archaeologists have found shell middens, basically, old trash heaps that tell us about their diet. Lots of crocodile, turtle, fish remains.
Crocodiles, wow.
Yeah. But the big finds came in the 1950s. They discovered these limestone caves packed with skeletal remains, really well preserved, some even painted with red ochre and artifacts, too.
And that really proved they'd been there a long time.
For sure. The evidence points to about 1,000 years of presence before Columbus showed up. It's pretty sobering to read in the notes that these same sites are now threatened by things like climate change and development.
That climate link is interesting, too. One source mentioned potential climate shifts around 1500 already causing changes for the Lucayans even before Europeans really made an impact.
Right. It highlights how vulnerable the islands have always been to environmental change. A recurring theme, really.
A theme we'll definitely come back to. And population-wise, before contact, how many Lucayans are we talking about?
The estimates vary a bit, as they often do, but the sources suggest maybe somewhere between 30,000 and 60,000 people.
So a really established, thriving society with its own history.
Which, of course, leads us right into the event that just fundamentally changed everything.
1492, Columbus.
Yep. He makes landfall on an island he calls San Salvador, though, there's still some academic debate. Was it the San Salvador we know today, or maybe Cat Island?
Huh. And he named the whole chain Bahamas, right, from the Spanish.
Yeah, Bahama, shallow waters. Pretty descriptive, actually.
Fits. So what was that first encounter like, according to the records?
Well, based on Columbus's own writings, it started peacefully. He described the Lucayans as calm, friendly, welcoming. They traded goods.
But we know that didn't last. Columbus wasn't just looking for spices or gold in the ground.
No, he saw wealth in the people themselves. The sources are really clear on this. He quickly moved towards enslaving the Lucayans.
God, that's bleak.
It kicked off this incredibly rapid and brutal period. The Spanish brought conquest, they brought diseases the Lucayans had no immunity to, and they forced them into labor, often shipping them off to other islands.
And the effect was total devastation.
Pretty much. By 1520, so just about 30 years later, the research indicates almost the entire population, those tens of thousands of people, were either dead or had been forcibly removed.
Just think about that. 1,000 years of culture, history, life on those islands just gone in a single generation.
It's a massive, tragic break in the historical record. As one note puts it, the greatest part of the island's human history was basically lost. And after the Lucian labor force was gone, and since there wasn't much gold, Spain's attempts to actually colonize the Bahamas mostly fizzled out. A few failed settlements, but that was about it.
So the islands were kind of claimed, but empty for a long stretch, until England showed up much later.
Right. Fast forward almost 200 years. In 1670, England stakes its claim, ignoring Spain's. The king gives a charter to a group called the Lords Proprietors.
But they didn't have much luck settling it either initially.
No, they struggled. Though some English settlers had actually come over earlier from Bermuda around 1647. And right from the start, their lives revolved around the sea.
What were they doing?
The sources list things like cutting special wood for dyes, raking salt from salt pans, catching turtles, collecting something called ambergris.
Ambergris, what's that?
It's this waxy stuff from whales, used to be really valuable for perfumes, and importantly, salvaging shipwrecks. This whole pattern sea-based work lasted for like 200 years, even when officials tried to push farming.
Okay, so you've got islands in a key location, not much central control, settlers focused on the sea, including wreck salvaging. Sounds like a recipe for
Pirates. Absolutely. It was the perfect setup. The location was critical smack in the middle of shipping lanes between North America, the Caribbean, and Europe.
every ship had to sail past.
Pretty much. Add to that the weak British control early on, and it became an ideal base to operate from, to hide out. Even the wrecks salvaging the settlers relied on. The Spanish often just called that piracy anyway.
And this lack of control made them vulnerable too, right? The sources mention attacks.
Yeah, Nassau got hammered by the Spanish and French multiple times between 1700 and 1713. It got so bad the administration basically collapsed. Settlers scattered to other islands, Eleuthera, Harbor Island, Abaco. That chaos just opened the door wider for pirates.
And then there was that treaty in 1713, the Treaty of Utrecht.
Right, that officially ended privateering, state-sponsored raiding. So a lot of those now unemployed privateers just turned to full-on piracy.
And they flocked to the Bahamas.
Yep. Big time. Especially in the 1710s, 1720s, they caused havoc for shipping in the whole region.
Okay, so this is where the British authorities finally say, okay, enough is enough.
Exactly. They decide to really crack down. They send Governor Woodes Rogers. He arrives in 1718, actually dispatched under a Commodore Edward Vernon initially.
Woodes Rogers, the famous pirate hunter.
That's the one. He offered a king's pardon surrender, and you're forgiven. Many took it. For those who didn't, well...
Things got serious. Fortifications, fighting. Vernon's earlier actions in 1718 were apparently quite harsh executions, imprisonments.
Yeah, they were determined to break the pirates' hold and impose British authority. It was a real struggle to wrest control back, but it marked a shift towards a more formal, though still developing colonial government. The Pirate Republic era was ending.
Okay, so moving past the pirate era, another huge shift happens around the time of the American Revolution.
Yeah, this was really pivotal. Britain loses its mainland colonies, so it needs a secure base in the Caribbean. And the Bahamas suddenly looked much more important.
Which meant new people arriving.
Thousands. Loyalists, people who'd backed the British, fled the new United States. The sources mention a big fleet arriving in 1781. It wasn't just white loyalists. They brought thousands of enslaved people with them, plus soldiers, both black and white, and a fair bit of wealth.
And that totally changed the islands, especially New Providence.
Dramatically. By 1783, New Providence, which had been called a barren island, was suddenly a much more developed and prosperous colony, at least on the surface.
So what did these loyalists try to do? Set up plantations like they had in America?
Many tried. They often attempted to replicate that plantation economy, sometimes using lands the Lucayans had cleared centuries earlier. So you get this new layer added onto the old seafaring economy.
The farming was tough there. Did any other economic activities take off? The sources mention some surprising ones.
Yeah, there are a couple of really interesting examples. One is sponge fishing. It didn't really boom until the 1830s, apparently partly because Americans were trying to avoid taxes on Florida sponges.
Seriously. Tax avoidance drove an industry.
Seems like it played a role, and it became massive. By the late 1870s, sponges were like 70–80% of all exports. Maybe half the population depended on it for their living.
Wow. That's huge reliance on one thing, which usually means.
Bust. Yeah. Overfishing and some kind of blight or disease hit the sponge beds hard after 1885. By 1900, the industry was practically dead. Classic boom and bust.
But then there was another weird success story mentioned. Cucumbers.
Right. This is pretty ingenious. They apparently figured out how to farm these coastal mudflats that seemed totally useless because they were full of salt. They used controlled flooding and drainage systems.
Really?
Yeah. And by the 1870s, they were exporting cucumbers grown in this salty mud to places like New York and Chicago. Finding a way.
Adapting. Still, that location that made it good for trade also made it a target sometimes.
Definitely. Nassau got captured and looted by the French in 1798. And much, much later, even things happening far away could hurt them, like the St. Lawrence Seaway opening in Canada in 1959. That diverted shipping traffic and caused real hardship for Bahamian sailors and ports.
Always connected to those wider currents of trade and power. Which brings us to a really central and difficult part of the story, slavery.
Yeah, it's impossible to understand Bahamian history without confronting slavery. New Providence especially was an early and significant port in the transatlantic slave trade system.
And the British were the main power involved in the trade there.
Yes, and the number of enslaved people grew massively through this forced importation. Especially after the Loyalists arrived with the people they enslaved, the black population vastly outnumbered the white population by 1800.
The sources put this in the context of what was happening elsewhere. Slave revolts in places like Grenada, Jamaica, Saint Domingue, and the abolitionist movement growing in Britain itself.
All right, all that pressure was building, and it led to Britain taking action. First, in 1807, they passed an act that abolished the trade in slaves, so no more importing people.
But slavery itself was still legal.
Exactly. People already enslaved remained enslaved. They could still be bought and sold within the colony, and importantly, their children were born into slavery. The actual end of slavery came later.
With the Slavery Abolition Act of 1833.
Correct. That act mandated emancipation across the British Empire starting August 1st, 1834.
And the sources detail the immediate aftermath. Compensation was paid out.
To the slave owners for the loss of their property, funded by British taxpayers, took nearly 40 years to pay off that debt.
And the people who were freed.
They were initially forced into a system called apprenticeship for 2 years, basically requiring them to keep working on the same plantations, though I think the sources mentioned it was actually cut short in the Bahamas.
So freedom wasn't exactly straightforward.
Uh-huh.
The sources paint a pretty complex picture of what came next.
Yeah, it wasn't like suddenly everyone believed in racial equality. The material points to a lot of lingering prejudice among the white elite. There were documented fears about the newly freed black population, using terms like illiterate poor blacks.
And even talk of needing to, disarm a dangerous and ferocious populace.
That kind of sentiment is recorded. There were even official proposals, like one from a Lieutenant Governor Walker, suggesting providing free passage to an happy home, basically, encouraging the formerly enslaved to just leave the Bahamas.
Wow, so legal freedom was one thing, but true equality and overcoming generations of brutal oppression, that was a much longer struggle.
Absolutely. The end of slavery was a monumental step, but it didn't magically fix everything overnight. The transition was messy and filled with fear and inequality.
But out of that terrible history, out of the forced arrival of people from West Africa, something unique emerged: Bahamian culture.
Definitely. The sources really emphasize how profoundly African influenced the culture is. It's a direct legacy of those enslaved West Africans brought over by Europeans.
You can even hear it in the language, right? The Bahamian dialect.
Yeah, it's described as this really interesting mix. English is the base, but it's blended with words, rhythms, structures from various African languages and dialects. The notes mention influences from the Gullah Geechee people, whose ancestors came with the Loyalists from the Georgia-Carolina coast. It apparently has quirks that can trip up outsiders.
Language carrying history. What about stories, traditions?
Oh, a really rich oral tradition. You find versions of Brer Rabbit tales, lots of riddles, proverbs, and singing, chanting. Specific customs tied to festivals like Christmas or Independence Day are super important.
And the music sounds incredibly vibrant.
It really is. Again, a mix of African and European roots. You've got unique genres like rake and scrape.
Rake and scrape? What instruments do they use?
Things like a carpenter's saw, played by bending it, and a washtub bass. Also, goombay music with its heavy drum rhythms, chanting, sometimes mime. Calypso's big too. Plus, a strong tradition of marching brass bands. And other instruments got mixed in over time: accordions, banjos, violins, even something called a harmoniquette.
That sounds amazing.
Yeah.
But the biggest, most visible cultural explosion has to be Junkanoo, right?
Oh, Junkanoo is iconic. It's this massive street parade, especially famous on Boxing Day and New Year's Day mornings. It's just an explosion of sound drums, cowbells, whistles, and color. People wear these incredibly elaborate costumes, often made from crepe paper, and dance in competing groups. It's spectacular.
And the origins go back to the time of slavery.
That's what the sources trace it to. Back to the late 1700s, enslaved people had limited time off around Christmas. They used that time for their own celebrations with masks, costumes, whatever instruments they could make. Junkanoo evolved out of those roots.
But it's interesting how the sources talk about modern Junkanoo. It's not just presented as some perfectly preserved tradition from the past.
No, exactly. One source calls it a social imaginary, meaning, yes, it has deep roots, but it's also been consciously shaped and promoted, especially after independence. It works on multiple levels, it builds national pride inside the Bahamas, but it's also packaged as a major cultural attraction for tourists and international audiences.
So it's both history and a living, evolving thing that serves modern purposes. The sources also mention things like distinctive architecture, those ridged roofs, clapboard houses, shutters, and folk art connected to Junkanoo.
Right, all these pieces build that unique Bahamian identity.
And that strong sense of identity, combined with the history of colonialism and slavery, must have fueled the drive for self-government. Let's talk about the road to independence.
It was definitely a long road. The sources say there isn't one single date everyone agrees was the start. Some point to the 1930s and the Great Depression. Some say it was Black veterans returning after World War II with new expectations.
Or the founding of political parties.
Right, like the PLP, the Progressive Liberal Party in '53, or the FNM Free National Movement in 1970. Those were crucial organizational steps.
But underlying all that, the main goal was pretty clear.
Yeah, self-determination. The desire for Bahamians to govern Bahamians, it wasn't just political, it was economic, cultural, even psychological, taking control of their own destiny.
What were some of the key steps along the way?
Well, getting universal male suffrage in 1959 was big, and then the election of Sir Lyndon Pinbling as the first Black premier that marked the arrival of majority rule.
And the final push for independence, how did that happen?
According to the research, it involved some pragmatic negotiations. They decided to work towards improved constitutional arrangements through talks with the UK government.
Which led to something called wardship in 1973. What was that?
It was like a step just before full independence. It basically gave the Bahamian government control over its own domestic economy and local affairs, tourism, banking, shipping, getting things ready.
And then the big day, July 10th, 1973, independence.
Yep. The Bahamas became a free, sovereign, and independent nation. The sources describe the mood as, full of grace, glory, excitement, maybe some underlying nervousness, too, about going it alone. A really powerful moment.
Absolutely. Okay, so that brings us to the modern Bahamas. Based on the material you had, what are the key things defining the country today?
Well, economically, it really stands on two main legs, according to the research.
And the biggest leg, by far, is tourism.
Hugely important. Those 2018 figures cited showed it was over half the GDP, responsible for something like 43% of all jobs. The main draw, obviously, is that incredible marine environment, the water, the beaches, the reefs. People come for sailing, diving, snorkeling, all that.
And it's not just one kind of tourism, is it? You've got the huge resorts, the casinos, especially near Nassau, drawing cruise ships and mass tourism.
Right, like Atlantis on Paradise Island. But then on the smaller out islands, you find more niche stuff, ecotourism, fishing lodges, places focused on history.
And they've invested heavily in airports and seaports to support all this.
Yeah, big infrastructure investments. The sources talk about boom times linked to building those mega resorts, or when airline competition heats up.
Okay, so tourism is one pillar. What's the other?
Financial services, offshore finance. The Bahamas has been doing this since the 1960s.
Right, the whole tax haven idea, though it's more complex now.
Exactly. The material describes it as a regulated, low-tax place for international banking, investment funds, trusts. You've got the central bank, the Securities Commission overseeing things.
They promote it as world-class, but the sources mention some challenges, like increased regulation.
Yeah, it seems like it went from minimal regulation back in the 80s to much stricter international rules and compliance demands from the 90s onwards. And being a client-based industry, it's pretty vulnerable to global economic downturns or changes in international tax laws that can really hit growth.
Okay, vulnerabilities. That leads us to maybe the biggest one highlighted in the sources, climate change.
Yeah, this comes across as a massive, almost existential threat. And the reason is simple. Most of the Bahamas is incredibly low-lying, like just 1 or 2 meters above sea level on average.
So rising sea levels aren't some abstract future problem.
Not at all. It's a direct threat of islands literally being submerged. One source even mentioned a projection, and it is just a projection that maybe a third of the land mass could be underwater by 2030. That's stark.
Wow.
Plus, you've got warming sea temperatures, changing rain patterns, and stronger hurricanes hitting more often. The sources mention storms in 1999 and 2004 as damaging examples.
And these things cause real problems on the ground, right? Flooding.
More flooding, definitely, especially where development has removed natural buffers like wetlands or mangroves, more coastal erosion, bigger storm surges, salt water getting into the limited freshwater supplies.
And what about those reefs that tourism depends on?
They're getting hit hard. Coral bleaching, where the coral turns white and can die, has been seen since at least 1998. Pollution, dredging for development, and the changing climate are all degrading the reefs. And that's critical not just for tourism, but because reefs protect coastlines and support fisheries.
Are there efforts to fight back? Conservation.
Yes, the material mentions quite a bit.
Yeah.
They've established national parks, both on land and sea, like the Exuma Cays Land and Sea Park, which was one of the first. There are efforts to protect unique Bahamian species, birds, bats, reptiles found nowhere else.
Action plans, NGOs involved.
Yep, environmental action plans exist, and groups like the Bahamas National Trust work with the government. Though the sources do note that things like funding and resources can be a challenge for conservation bodies. International agreements also help push for stronger environmental laws.
It sounds like a really tough situation. An economy depending on an environment that's under direct threat.
It's a very difficult balancing act.
Okay, lastly, the sources touched on the modern political situation. What did they say?
Well, the description was largely static since independence, meaning power has mostly just switched back and forth between the two main parties, the FNM and the PLP.
Were there criticisms mentioned in the material?
Yeah, some were noted. Things like the government having difficulty controlling urban sprawl, especially around Nassau, and criticism of some long-term development deals, arguing they prioritized big projects over environmental protection or local needs.
Anything about recent efforts to tackle bigger issues?
There was mention of a constitutional commission set up after the 2012 election to look at potential changes.
And how was that commission's approach described in the notes?
It was interesting. The source characterized its initial philosophy as quite materialist, focused on concrete problems, pessimistic about finding easy fixes, and maybe reactive more than visionary. Like, they started out not expecting huge changes were possible, though apparently they gained some optimism later.
Did they highlight specific challenges the country faces?
According to the source material, yes. Things like patron-client cronyism, endemic corruption, the big gap between wealth and poverty, and perceived issues with leadership qualities. Again, it's important we stress these are observations and viewpoints presented within the sources we were given.
Understood. Impartial reporting. And there was also mention of trying to expand voting rights to descendants of slaves.
Yes, that effort was noted as well.
So it paints a picture of a nation still working through some complex internal issues, governance, inequality, while facing these huge external pressures like climate and the global economy.
That seems like a fair summary of what the sources convey.
And just quickly, internationally, the Bahamas is active.
Yeah, despite its size, it has quite a few embassies and missions abroad. It's a member of all the major bodies, the UN, CARICOM for the Caribbean region, the Organization of American States, the Commonwealth, World Bank, IMF. It participates in global initiatives, so it definitely punches its weight on the international stage.
Okay, so looking back at this whole deep dive, all these sources, we started with the Lucayans thousands of years ago. Then Columbus, the Spanish impact, the pirates, the British, the loyalists, slavery, abolition.
The incredible culture that emerged, like Junkanoo, the long fight for independence.
And now, the modern nation, built on tourism and finance, but facing down this massive environmental threat from climate change. It really is a story of constant change and adaptation, isn't it?
It really is. You see how the geography shaped things, but also how these huge global forces, empire, trade, economics, climate, have constantly washed over the islands. And through it all, the resilience and creativity of the Bahamian people responding to those pressures.
So this deep dive hopefully gave you, our listener, a sense of those layers. Maybe the thing to leave you thinking about, reflecting on from all this material is this.
How does a small island nation like the Bahamas, whose identity, whose whole economy is so deeply tangled up with its beautiful but incredibly vulnerable natural environment, how does it navigate today's world?
Yeah, how does it balance the demands of global tourism and finance, the unavoidable impacts of climate change that it didn't cause, and those international rules,
Huh.
while also trying to hold on to its unique culture, its history, and steer its own independent course.
It's a massive balancing act, one that has huge implications, not just for the Bahamas, but for so many places around the world facing similar challenges right now. Definitely something to think about.